fire insurance. Okay, and that requires assessing risk and exposures. How can a fire start? Developing written plans and policies, especially for commercial buildings, training employees with fire drills, etc., and evaluating and monitoring, having things in place that have to be certified, like your sprinkler system, and documenting all that. And the key thing is, it's really very similar because all of those things that are there for fire are really risk mitigation techniques, things you do to lower the frequency, exposure, or duration of a fire. Well, it's the very same thing for cybersecurity. The curious thing is everybody takes so many measures with regard to fire, including insurance, yet very few, comparatively speaking, have the same thing in place for cybersecurity. And your chance of a cyber attack are many times greater than ever having a fire. Okay, so moving on, what we're going to do is talk about some of that. And, here's some things to be aware of. I mentioned a little bit about this. There's regulatory fines and penalties. For those that have insurance, the policies won't cover it. And some states like New Jersey in particular, and there are others, prohibit the payment of that. So the real question then is, how do I kind of deal with all this? And over the next several slides, we're going to show probably how some of you feel, which is, if we could bring up the next slide, the pressures and problems. Most of us don't know what's covered, why. And as we'll see on the next two slides that we'll show this is some of the regulations and rules. And if this looks like a gobbledygook of all kinds of logos, to be sure it is. Each one of these, I would say that everybody on this will be impacted by at least several of these rules or regulations and requirements, which are laws. Okay, HIPAA is for, health information. There's PCI, which is all about credit cards. There's GLBA, which went into effect with some very new and stringent requirements a couple of days ago, December 9th. There's ITAR, GDPR. All of these impact people and organizations and businesses. And most of us, through vendor contracts or just normal course of business, are impacted by a couple of these. And there's mandatory requirements, and there's fines and penalties if there is a hack or there is a problem and you haven't complied with it. So what we're talking about today is this myriad of rules and regs that are very complex and changing. And we're here to help you, give you information about here's the problem and some ways to kind of deal with it. Okay, so this is probably what some of you may look like on the next slide with trying to deal with this. It's like, who's on first? Where do I turn? Most organizations we deal with want to know, what am I covered by? What do I have to meet? And how do I do that? And who can help me do that? So as this next slide shows, this is a little bit about who's covered. And the simple answer to any of these is focus on becoming a lower profile target. And the way you do that is by implementing what are called good cyber hygiene practices or best cyber hygiene practices. And these were really created by cybersecurity experts worldwide. And as the next slide shows, a list of the most common ones that you should do. Like if you do some number of these or all of these, you've gone a long way to developing a very robust cybersecurity program. Doesn't mean you're never going to get hacked. Okay, there's nothing you can do to avoid a hack. And that's because even the multi-billion-dollar companies who do all this and then some get hacked. The reason you would do these is one, regulatory compliance, but two, you're lowering the frequency, exposure, and duration of anything happening. And if you can do that, it's going to lessen the cost and lessen the burden. And doing some of these to a bigger number of them help you start at the beginning with policies and training, and then documenting that you did things, and then on to things like multi-factor authentication. We'll talk about some of this. And these are the very specific practices that all those regulations require you, some more, some less, to follow, to be compliant. So that's one of the pathways. Now to just set the stage a little bit more, we're going to have Chris talk about what happens when the what hits the fan. What happens when you have a breach, you have a problem, and anybody have an idea how much that might cost? So I'd like to now turn it over to Chris, who handles many of these claims for many of the carriers on a pretty much daily basis.
Yes, definitely on a daily basis. Thanks a lot, Robert. Yeah, so, this is a lot of information, and really the last two slides and the slides listing all of the various regulations and the best practices. We could do a whole presentation on just that information alone, but you look at these, some things like antivirus, patch management, they're listed as a best practice, but it's come to be an expectation. And then as technology advances, you learn things like endpoint detection and response tools. They're becoming more and more expected and needed just to keep ahead of these threat groups and attacks. So there's a lot to digest here, but my role primarily, we are data privacy attorneys here at Mullen Coughlin. We focus solely on data privacy work, and we end up getting called in most of the time after someone suffered an incident. And as you can imagine, that is mostly there's a technical aspect to this, and there's a legal aspect to this. That's those last two slides I was just referring to. When there's been any kind of intrusion to data, there duties may be immediately triggered, and there can be timelines in the various laws that you need to follow before you're creating another potential violation. So there are legal issues right at the get-go. That's why you get connected to a law firm on these technical issues right out of the gate. As your counsel on a matter, I'm most concerned with what data has been compromised. But in order to get there, we have to take a lot of steps and figure out the scope of this. So what ends up happening is we engage a forensic investigator to figure out the facts. Has there been a compromise of employee information? Has there been a compromise of consumer information? What types of information have been exposed? And has there been a compromise of confidential client information? So we need to determine what happened before we can know what duties are triggered and make sure we're compliant with them. So immediately you have a law firm and you have a forensic firm engaged working for you. If we determine there's been an exposure, now we have to put notices together to affected individuals. The various statutes that Robert was referring to have duties in them. When there's an exposure of protected information, you must notify the affected individuals and tell the regulator. So once we determine there's been that kind of exposure, we often bring in a third vendor who provides the services related to notifications, the printing of notices, the mailing, the call center, because if you're notifying 1,000 people, there's going to be an influx of questions. Why did I get this letter? How did this happen? We need to be able to respond to those people's concerns quickly. So we often stand up a call center. And the other thing is credit monitoring. So as you can see, the direct costs from just addressing an incident first party are piling up. We may be 2 weeks into it with all these vendors helping us out. Another one that we all often work with is a public relations expert. These events can certainly lead to notice and therefore a public aspect. And so having a public relations expert on the team responding to an incident can be extremely helpful. We don't always retain them, but it's just another part of the insurance panel that you should know about, and adds up to these costs. So at this point, we've now gone through investigating, we've identified notice duties, we've provided notice. Following that, now you have the regulators asking questions. They're going to be interested to make sure that you've taken steps to prevent this from happening again. They may even dig deeper and ask for historical information regarding your risk assessment process, your policies and procedures, your training. They now want to see that you're a good citizen, that you're doing these best practices, and that you're compliant with the law, that you are making sure you're protecting the data that you take, you know, that you need to do your business. So following these notices, we are often engaged with the regulators in deeper investigations. And then there's the potential for litigation. That doesn't happen a lot, maybe 5% of our cases. We saw over 3,000 cases in our firm last year, and maybe 5% ended up in litigation. I will say this year, I think that number is going to rise. There's more and more litigation. There's more and more plaintiff firms out there that are getting their feet, you know, wet with these cases, and so the litigation potential is rising. So all of these are types of services that can be protected by insurance. So it's the kind of thing that the insurance is absolutely vital in making sure you can address these things, because as I said, these costs pile up very quickly, and you really have no choice but to take these steps in order to be compliant with the law. Now, on the next slide, it mentions one of the biggest problems we're having these days, and that is, or I thought it did, I'm sorry, but one of the things I wanted to mention was ransomware attacks. That's sort of an incident response on steroids. There it is. We're seeing maybe 35% of our cases involve ransomware, and so it's happening every day. It's a big problem. It's sort of two problems at the same time. You have shut down your system. The threat actor gets in. They encrypt files on your system. They don't actually take them and ransom them. They encrypt your system. They lock it up. You can't use your system. So there's an immediate business interruption and possibly a public communication that you have to make about your service disruption and your inability to take care of your customers. So while that is being addressed as quickly as possible, we're still doing the typical incident response, investigating and figuring out if there's any mandatory notice because of an exposure of information. And these threat groups they're not only getting in and locking up your system, they are stealing data, they're copying data so that they can double extort you. They can tell you, if you don't need the decryption keys because you have good backups, we don't care. We're going to publish your data unless you pay us. So it's a real nightmare, and obviously the costs there are exponential. I've seen demands as high as 15 million for even medium-sized firms, and you know, the average demand is certainly in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you know, unfortunately, there may be no option. Sometimes clients have to consider paying because the files are gone and their business is shut down, and the only way to get it back, because these threat actors delete backups, they encrypt backups, the only way to get it back is to pay the ransom. So it's a real problem, and it's very expensive. So then I think I was up to 2 more slides ahead.
And now with the insurance aspect,
Yeah.
which is something to keep in mind as Bob talks through some of this, all the things that Chris has just mentioned. Any organization, everybody on this call will have to do, whether they have insurance or not. These are not things that you do just because you have insurance. These are things that are regulatorily required to address a hack, a breach, et cetera. And, you know, moreover, it's not just where you are, but it's affected by the rules of all the states that your customers are in. And P.S., most of the state rules differ from state to state. So it's the type of thing that if you don't have cyber best hygiene practices in place, you should. And if you don't have insurance in place, at least to cover a modicum of the things, you should. And so I think now Bob is going to comment a little bit on some of the insurance aspects.
Thank you, Robert. The slide that's on the screen now reiterates a point that Robert made earlier. It is not just the large companies of the world. It's not just the Targets or the Home Depots of the world. As a matter of fact, the Target, which is one of the most prominent claims that have ever occurred, was caused actually by their HVAC contractor who had an electronic data interface to Target's system, creating the vulnerability. So most of the claims are, according to a survey from, I think this is RSM International did this survey, 28% of the middle market executives claim that their company experienced a data breach of that survey, which is a pretty significant. I bet 28% didn't also have a fire last year. So there is a more prominent risk in this area. 64% of those surveyed anticipate there's going to be unauthorized users or attempt to access the system. I believe it's higher than, I should be higher than that. There are folks that are likely inside your system now. It's just a matter of whether or not they're using the data against you. From a coverage perspective, 65% of the respondents carry cyber insurance, but only 64% of those respondents really understand what's inside the policy. And that's what's important. When I say understanding what's inside your policy, first you have to understand your risk, and your insurance broker or agent or insurance company has to understand what you're trying to protect. It's not just retailers. It's intellectual property is everywhere. It's inside the manufacturing industry, the distribution industry, the service industry. Their ransomware can impact anyone these days. Matter of fact, and it doesn't have to be your system. For example, Rackspace is one of the largest email providers in the world, next to Microsoft and Amazon and the other big ones. Right now, they're currently inside of a ransomware attack. So all of the folks that use Rackspace could not receive emails or send emails for now. We're going on 2 weeks. And how does that impact your business? And if Rackspace can't bring that information forward when the ransom is ultimately resolved, you may have missed 2 weeks of emails. If you're in the legal industry, you know how risky that is. If you're in any industry, you know how risky that is. So next slide, what are we doing from an insurance perspective? Well, the insurance market has been rapidly changing. It's been in a crisis mode for the past 2 years. Average rate increases last year were 38%. However, that 38% was also coupled with reductions in coverage, reductions in sublimits, reductions in the form of co-insurance. For example, we've seen 30% rate increase, but a 50% co-insurance. That clause, if you read the policy closely, means 50 cents of every dollar of the loss is funded by you. So you get half the coverage for more price. It's not a good position to be in. This year, it's in the mid-20s as some more capital's entering the market in the cyber. But what's happening now is if you don't have certain, let's say 12 of the 17 or 18 that was listed in the previous slide, I think already taken care of, carriers will not consider quoting you. For example, multi-factor authentication. Okay. If your application's not accurate, we're seeing claims denied based on alleged misrepresentations on an application. There was an incident in which travelers denied a claim because they didn't have multi-factor authentication throughout their system, or a portion of their system was turned off for convenience sake, and they had a claim. And travelers alleged a misrepresentation in an application, did not provide the coverage. So going through the process is significantly. Also, sublimits are significant in the areas that the carriers are worried about. Ransomware. Deductibles are in various formats. We've seen record deductibles, meaning the policy will not trigger unless at least 10,000 names are exposed. Things like that. So we're looking. It's important for you to understand what you're trying to protect. So your insurance agent can custom design the policy. There is no standard insurance policy contract in this business. You can't just say, I have cyber. You actually have to read the policy, understand what it's covering, and whether it's covering and to what extent the exposure that you're worried about.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I'd like to just emphasize. Often we see customers, they don't know what's in their policy. And what you really need is someone to help walk you through that and talk about how you do business. One of the things that was mentioned was they could already be in your system. Why are they in your system? Well, very often they'll put something in your system, and what are they monitoring? And this is something that our Bill White really taught a bunch of us about, is they're just laying dormant, but they now can copy every keystroke. They can see your bank account numbers, your access to banks. They could see when a large sum of money comes in, let's say for a down payment on a project or something, and snatch that money instantly, move it out. And the worst news is there's no coverage for that. A lot of people think, oh, well, my money in the bank is covered up to X dollars. Well, that's if the bank becomes insolvent. That's not at all if the bad guys take your money from a commercial enterprise. So you're basically out of luck. And think about if the money in your bank account, as all of our organizations are small to mid-sized, was totally taken out Friday night or tonight, what would you face tomorrow with the loss of that money? It might be that you just got in a very huge deposit or just put in a thing and it's gone. And this is more and more what these people are doing. And it's not like they have to create the software. The bad guys have created this and will rent a bad group this ability. So it's really important to keep track of this. Also, the defenses you put in place, KP Interface and Bazaar are two premier managed service companies. And a lot of what they have shown is multi-factor authentication, endpoint protection, all these things that are being required. Not everybody does them the way they should be done and can make sure that they're in place. And as Bob was just talking about, if they're not, when you have a claim or when you have an issue, it can be denied because somebody turned it off, et cetera. So all we advise is get to an experienced expert and ask them, what are your credentials? What have you done? How many of these have you done? Because there's a myriad of entities in this, and you'll hear more from them in the lightning round, especially about some of the issues that we run across. But this is something that, you're betting your business, okay? And you're betting your livelihood, and you just don't make the mistake. So how do we deal with all this? How do we implement these security practices when I don't know, which end is up? Well, every cyber regulation out there requires some number, as we've been saying, of those 17 or so practices. Some more, some even have the added of a couple of things. And what we've done is we've combined subject matter experts, the ones you're hearing on this, with an ability to implement a basic something as a building block, as a foundation, as a cornerstone for meeting these, and then you can incrementally add. So we're going to just quickly walk through that, and then we'll get into some questions, okay? So what we're looking about is what we've struggled with is how do you make this affordable? Okay, we've seen things from people charge tens of thousands of dollars to write plans, to determine like what must a company adhere to. We've kind of, with the ability to marry technology with expertise, kind of boil that down into a systematized or framework, and we're going to show you just an overview of that in the next couple of slides. Okay, basically 5 steps. Develop policies. The policies enumerate what you're going to do to avoid the hassles, what you're going to do to avoid the exposures. You're going to then train your people, and you also need to remind yourself, did I do the task? Many times you get a list of things to do. Did you do them all? Because they're required. Cyber insurance is certainly part of that. And IT technology to implement those practices on that earlier list are required. These are the essential pieces of solving the cybersecurity program puzzle. Okay. Again, these address what these practices are. And as everyone's been saying, some rules or regs require more. A vendor contract could require all of these, okay? Or you might be subject to various regulations that require a number of these in combination. So you start with, what am I bound by, rule, regulation, contract-wise? Marry that to what things you have to do. Again, our programs explain all that. Let me put that in simple terms. And here's a stair-step way we've come up with where you can implement something that's very affordable, add to it, and grow as you need to. And it's vendor agnostic. The experts on this are giving you advice, and we remain available to give you advice. And that way we feel the more you know, the better you are to say, okay, I want to work with that entity or that person because they know what they're talking about. There's a lot of people in this, and I'll say it simply, who don't, yet project they do. And you'll find out about that if you're on the short end of the stick of a cyber event. You might have used an IT company that says, oh, we could do that, and they can't. Okay, or you might get counsel for someone that you know and they don't know the ins and outs, or somebody that sold you insurance policies and it's not aligned with where your risk and your coverage and exposures are. All right, so starting with simple. Okay, we have a basic free program that's really a cyber resource center. That's where you go for information. Most of the companies on here can start with as little as this 10 user system that's very, very inexpensive. It's like $720 annually. You can grade up to the next level, which is to meet certain insurance requirements. And some of the companies here are covered by doing government contract work, DoD, aerospace, et cetera. And so those programs are starting points. They're very simple. They're very inexpensive. Also, anyone on this who are any member of the chamber will receive a 10% discount on the subscription amounts courtesy of the chamber. All right, so on the next one is really now we've kind of, and I know we've gone through a lot, we've highlighted it. We're going to get now to some questions in the lightning round, and especially I'll turn now it over to Skelly, I guess, to have some of the questions.
Hey, thanks so much, you guys. I want to start by, I want to do two things. For folks who are listening, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll do everything we can to get to all the questions, or raise your hand. So to kick us off, I want to draw in some of our technical experts, Brian Pickle and Mike Bazar. Brian, we've heard about these cyber attacks. Can you walk us through, I get cyber attacked, what does it feel like? How does it work? Can you tell us about that?
Speaker.
Brian, if you're
Sorry,
talking,
I got it. I'm muted. Sorry about that.
Okay. Now it's a real
yeah,
meeting. It's not a real meeting until we get to say you're on mute. Go ahead.
we hear a lot today about the risks and the potential costs from Chris, and the issues with insurance from Bob, et cetera. But what I'd like to talk about briefly is just what it feels like to be a company who is undergoing a cyber attack. You know, we can talk about it. I know there's an investment that companies need to make, but if you ever have to go through it, and thank God I haven't had to go through it, but I have seen people that I've known go through it, it's horrible. And it's horrible in many ways. First of all, it causes a ton of stress to the people that have to deal with it. It could be everybody, but especially the leaders that have to go through it. And that alone is very problematic. Secondly, cost. We talked a bit about that today. The cost associated with a cyber attack can be enormous. Thirdly, time. It takes a ton of time to coordinate with your legal firm, your insurance company, your IT firm, internally, press relations. All those kind of things take time that, you know, oftentimes people are not ready for it. They're not prepared for it either. So, and then finally, reputation. I mean, if you have to admit it, or you eventually, you know, people just find out about it, it can do significant damage to the company's reputation as well, which can be costly on an ongoing matter down the road with potential lost business as well. So the experience of it is difficult. Now, there are ways to address that with policies and procedures. And beyond that, you can do tabletop exercises, et cetera, to walk through what it would be like to respond to it, but you never really know until it happens. So my advice is do everything you can to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Mike, I have a question for you, but I think we can tee up that question well by first checking in with Bob. Bob, you mentioned a story, but you went through it really quickly. It was about a company that got hacked. They had insurance. They got their check from their insurance company, but they had a big surprise. Can you talk a little more about that story?
It's sure. I think one of the challenges, especially for small businesses that either outsource their IT or or don't have a significant expertise or access to expertise is filling out the application associated with getting the insurance. We always tell folks a good first step is to go through the underwriting process. Then you'll understand whether or not your systems are accurate. You may have to send that application to an IT provider. They may not respond, and not having that information available to you becomes a difficult and onerous process, which is, I guess, is what we're trying to solve here with Ultimate Risk. The issue becomes that if it's later found that you inaccurately completed the application, either through ignorance or on purpose, but usually through ignorance, the carrier may deny coverage or ask for their funds back after they do the investigation process and see that you're not actually implementing the systems that you say you have, basically alleging you're lying on the application, or they'll deny coverage or increase the cost of your coverage or limit your coverage based on the answers of the application. So if you don't have multi-factor authentication, it takes half the insurance marketplace out of the competition for your business. So that's important.
And to expand on that too a little bit, that Travelers case you mentioned, Travelers actually sued. So Travelers paid out a couple of $1 million to a company based on their policy. They then, through the audit, found out they didn't have two-factor and sued them and won in court to get their money back. So you go back to what Brian said about how does it feel? How would it feel to get hacked, to go through the event, to have all that happen, and then a couple months later have to write a $3 million check back to your insurance company because you didn't have stuff turned on that you were supposed to be. And it was like a couple of the admins didn't have it, right? I mean, it wasn't as a whole. They said they had two-factor, they had it on, but some people had turned it off. And that's what caused the breach. And to expand on that even a little bit more, like, so we do a lot of cyber, and that's what we're doing, Brian as well, right? We talk about this. So we probably 6 months ago had a client that we do kind of a co-managed thing. So we do a lot of the cyber in the back end, but they have an in-house guy. We said, hey, you need to update your firewall. There's a known vulnerability. And he said, I'll do it later. And we said, hey, you need to update your firewall. There's a known vulnerability. And he said, I'll do it later. And we did that 3 or 4 times. We offered to do it. We said, give us the passwords to it because we didn't have direct access into that firewall because it wasn't part of the agreement, but it wasn't part of what they wanted to do. And anyways, long story short, we caught, because we were protecting the servers, we caught somebody across the internet trying to mount network shares and got them disconnected, forced back out the door before anything happened. So they never actually successfully mounted data. They never accessed anything, but we saw that is a breach. That is the panic. That is, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? But because we had the right stuff in place, we're able to move them back out. However, it was preventable. If they had just updated the firmware on the firewall and we told them for the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, never would have even happened. And that's the kind of stuff that happens. Same thing, we're dealing with an issue with a rural hospital right now. And it's not even an issue. It looks, as far as we can tell, as a scripted login, but it was the same thing. Somebody, their in-house admin, so again, this is another co-managed thing, decided he didn't want two-factor on for his router login. We're doing the audits. He'd had it off for only a few days, and somebody logged into his account to the router. It looks like nothing's happened. We've checked all the logs. We've done all the things. So again, but if that had gone weeks, bad stuff would happen. So there's a big part of this where you have to have somebody in place. You have to have audits. You have to make sure the things are turned on, because now it's to the point, not just, oh yeah, we turned on two-factor. Oh yeah, we did the thing. Have you audited it? Did you verify it? Was it continued to be turned on? What was the process in that? What did it look like? So that you can go back and fight and go back to Travelers or the court or whatever and say, we have this in place. We do these audits at these timeframes. This is what's happened, and hopefully get it. Get your coverages or whatever it is. But those are the big things that we're seeing a lot of now that happens. And another, just because this is, I think, high profile that nobody really knows about. But Brian and I are in a group, and we were at a boot camp, I think it was last year, and they had the CEO of Camping World there, and he came in and he was talking about how they had gone through a data breach and how it made him feel was a really, like, he was utterly not prepared for that. They invested in IT, they invested in cybersecurity, they invested in all that, and how it made him feel. He said, like, he lost sleep. It was bad. It was all the other stuff. In that same kind of setting, I heard a story from somebody else who went through a ransomware attack, and the person that clicked the link that let the bad guy in sat in their office for a day crying. Like, do you want your staff to go through that? Because you didn't feel like it was worthwhile to do cyber or to check it, or it was too expensive, or whatever it is. So there's this whole gambit of things that we often don't think about until you're in the middle of it. But do you want to have to try to go comfort the person that maybe cost you the business? You're probably mad at them, but at the same time, they're going through this significant emotional, thing of, I let the bad guy in. I did the wrong thing. I clicked the wrong thing. And if you didn't have training and these other things in place, a lot of that at the end of the day probably comes back to you didn't help them and you put them in a position to fail. And as business leaders, none of us want to be there either.
Mike, that's such a great point. I'm really glad you brought in that human element, because I think we know that 99% of the time our workers want to do a good job. They want to do the right thing, but they need the education, they need the tools, they need the processes in place so they know what to do. So thank you so much for bringing that part in. I've got a question for Chris. I have a limited budget. I'm a small business. Am I better off putting my money into mounting these defenses or just getting bulletproof cybersecurity insurance?
That's a great question. And really, the answer is you need to think about a balance between the two. There really is, there are two components to an overall security posture that you need to implement. And it can be, there's requirements involved. So certain IT steps that you can take, security steps that you can take, are mandated depending on your business. We've talked about this a little bit, but like HIPAA, a lot of the federal requirements, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and then industry specific like New York Department of Financial Services, and even various of the regular state laws have terms in them requiring really specific security things be in place. So you need to address the actual security, but at the same time, vendor contracts often you can't engage with certain vendors unless you show that you have cyber insurance. So you don't get business unless you have the cyber insurance in place. And realistically, you're never going to be able to absolutely 100% knock out the bad guys. You really need to plan for a potential event, and having the resource of insurance in place is a part of that. So it really is.
Oh, I froze up. The one thing I was going to add, I was going to add, because he'd said it, like, you can't, if you go talk to anybody in cybersecurity and they tell you they can absolutely 100% guarantee you won't get hacked, they're lying to you. And so, hey, Chris, you froze up there for a second, but anyway, so like that should be part of it. Like Chris was saying, is you need to prepare for that eventuality. And that's why, like for us, we have those systems in place. So we've had these two events that really in the grand scheme of things are nothing burgers, because somebody logged in, we found it, we kicked them out, nothing bad happened, we can audit, we can prove, we can do all the stuff. But if you don't have that stuff in place, somebody's going to come in, they're going to test, then a few weeks later, they're going to come back, they're going to plant ransomware, and now it's a big, big, big bad problem, right? And so that's it at the end of the day, is if you're dealing as well with people that just say, oh yeah, if you put these in place, you'll never get hacked. 100% not right. Like it is, the FBI has been hacked. The federal government and multiple agencies has been hacked. Like people who spend billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars on cyber have been hacked. So it depends on how bad they want to get in. Our goal, and I think insurance and legal, all these other things, these regulations that are in, is to make you a hardened target so they look for somebody else. So how do you push that down? And the more hardened everybody becomes, the harder it is for hackers, and hopefully people start to leave that industry, which, by the way, is, I think, the third or fifth largest economy in the world if you made a country. So there is gobs and gobs of money to be made in it. And that's the stuff that everybody's having to deal with, and why you want to elevate the security is in general. And that's why I like regulation. So as a business owner, like we often look at it and go, friggin' regulation, I hate this stuff. The truth is it has to be there, because otherwise the general attitude is, well, I have antivirus, or Microsoft includes a free one or whatever. And it's nothing. Like I can walk through that all day long. I could send all of you a link today probably and get access to your systems. All I need to do is get you to click it, right? And it doesn't matter what security you have. There's only a few companies I've ever run into that we couldn't get that link to work. And so, that's the stuff that we're up against. That's why we're trying to elevate this conversation and say, do all the things as best you can. But it isn't go invest a gajillion in cyber, get the best cyber policy, get a good solid across the board, and you got way better chance than heavily invested in one piece of the stack.
I've got a question for Robert, and then after Robert answers that question, I'm going to ask each of you, what did we not cover that we should cover before we go? So Robert, here's my question for you. I took time out. I'm here to learn about cybersecurity, but as soon as this meeting's done, I'm going to dash back to my main responsibilities. What are a few initial action steps I could take to keep some momentum going to get my company on a path for cybersecurity?
Okay. Realizing that most of the folks don't know what they don't know. And, something befell us. We were hacked a number of years ago and turned to who we thought was keeping up with this, and they weren't. And suffice it to say that at each step, and everybody on this, these are the creme de la creme. These are the premier subject matter experts in each of their respective areas. We've searched out for them. Okay. And so when you're hearing from them, you got to get top-notch people who have the experience. A lot of people don't have the experience, very new industry. The other thing is what we went through as a company is searching all over the internet for answers and solutions and running into walls. We've really kind of built a cyber ecosystem where people can get the information for free. And all you got to do is just do cyberresourcecenter.com. Okay, it's a no-cost available resource center. You could look up all types of rules, regulations. What do I have to do? There's a help desk feature that you could request help and get to somebody who knows. Everything's in one place. So that's what I would really recommend. Is the first step is, I think, for people to become aware. And then how do you become aware and learn about it? Well, there's a couple of ways. You could spend endless hours hunting all over the place to try to get it. We feel we put something of value in the Cyber Resource Center. It's free. Just do cyberresourcecenter.com or go to the chamber and they'll certainly send you the connection and you can learn about it. And so that's what I would suggest, because the other thing is too, just like many of the rules and regulations, like workers' comp, filing the taxes, you don't get a notice in the mail by certified letter from each respective agency, hey, you got to comply with this. You are assumed to know enough to be in compliance with all these rules and regulations. And that's why when the what hits the fan, the fines and penalties can be very draconian. Okay, in the government, all they have to do is publish it once in the Federal Register, and that becomes due notification with any law. And many of these are laws and rules. So, again, just learn about it. There's a guidance through the path. At any point at the end of this, you'll see everybody's name and contact information is here. And we're here to ask a question. Okay, help us here. So that's what I would suggest.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So the final question, unless something else pops up in the chat, is what's the one thing that we should cover that we haven't covered yet? And I'm going to start with Bob.
What is the one thing? The one thing I would like to emphasize is if you don't have cyber liability insurance, reach out to your agent or broker and put a price point on it, meaning understand what it would cost, but not just understand what it would cost, understand what is not only covered by the policy, but understand what's not covered by the policy and focus your risk management efforts on what's not covered by the policy. And not everything is covered by insurance, as Chris was, getting into before he froze. You can't insure reputation. You can't insure stress. You can't insure everything. And that which is excluded by an insurance policy is what the insurance company's worried about. That's what you should be worried about.
Super helpful.
Hey, Bob, one other thing, if I could mention that, how important is it to get your insurance policy reviewed potentially by another carrier? I know I had that done for me. We have our insurance covered by somebody. I didn't know what to ask. I didn't know what was covered or not. So I had a third party, actually somebody I got to meet through Bob here, through Robert here, and they looked at it and said, you know what, Brian, this is excellent coverage for an excellent price. It gave me a little extra peace of mind to know at least somebody in the industry looked at it and said, yeah, you got a good program here. If they would have told me otherwise, that would have been valuable too. And said, look, you're missing some things.
Exactly. No one's in there are a lot of experts in a lot of different things. Cyber is one that's evolving every single day, and the those policies year to year are changing drastically. So what was competitive last year may not be competitive this year. So a periodic independent review of what you have, if not just to confirm what Brian said, that you have the most competitive available in the marketplace today, likely, which we say almost, we're batting about 50-50 of the policies that we review, can be really important. Because generally, of your insurance program, your cyber program is going to be less than 3% of your total spend from a property and casualty perspective after you insure your property and your autos and your products liability and all those other things. It's not going to be a big spend. So the broker may not have the expertise. They may just be seeing the ball and hitting the ball for you and giving you whatever the underwriters provides without questioning the competitive nature of it.
That's a great point. Chris.
Yes. Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about that I think is real important for people to understand is that the data owner is the one who has the duty to protect the data and provide notice if there's a breach. So a lot of people think I've outsourced my payroll to a payroll company, so I don't have to worry about that data anymore. It's their responsibility. If something happens to it, they will take care of it. And that is not true. Legally speaking, if you are the data owner, you have to make sure that the data stays protected. And if it gets exposed, you have to make sure that notice gets to those individuals. So maybe your service provider will end up doing notice on your behalf and fronting a lot of those costs. But regardless of all those legal problems that you might have to fight over during the course of an incident response, the data owner maintains that responsibility. So it's just an important thing to understand. A lot of people think I'm covered because I don't have data. I have service providers that hold that data. It doesn't mean that you may not be on the hook for some problem at the service provider.
Excellent. Mike.
Yeah, I think the thing I always tell everybody is you don't know what you don't know. And so like Brian and I know we both offer a very, very similar kind of audit, depending on who and scope and everything. It could be as cheap as free. But it is one of those things that I think from a cyber perspective, it is better to do if you have an IT provider, if you have an in-house guy. Like we've worked with a lot, Brian's worked a lot, like we'll work with whoever's there, or if you don't like the provider, if it's outsourced wherever, obviously we can replace people if we need to, but the goal isn't say you have in-house IT people to come in and replace them always, right? A lot of the time it's we can come in and help cover things they can't, help audit them, help back them up. And the problem is a lot of the time you'll get in-house people or providers that just do a bare minimum and they don't know what they don't know. The other thing a lot of people don't realize about the MSP industry and the IT industry is there's basically zero barrier to entry. I can take a laptop and I can say, I'm an IT provider and I can have no other training at all, right? I could be framing houses yesterday and today I decide I'm a cybersecurity expert. And there's nothing to vet that if I just go around and start saying I'm a cybersecurity expert. And by the way, nothing against people framing houses, but so one of the things I would say is that Cyber Resource Center, you can get in touch with Brian or I, or if not, and you've got somebody, ask them. But I would always generally say it's the same kind of thing as going to the insurance company, getting a third party, like get the audit, understand what's potentially broken, understand what your shortcomings are, come up with a plan to address those. And that would be the biggest thing I would say that a lot of people should do. And as part of this is, again, you've got to start picking a roadmap. So go get the quote on your cyber insurance. If you don't have it, get the free audit, talk to a lawyer, start putting the pieces in place to know what you don't know so you can at least start to tackle the problem. And if you just stick your head in your sand, you're just waiting for the federal government to tap you on the shoulder and say, that'll be $1 million, please. Right. So don't take that. That's a bad place to be.
That's nice, Mike. That's a nice 3-part checklist. Brian. Oh, you're on mute.
Scale, just skip me for a second. I had a coughing spell here.
Yes.
Sorry
We
about
all
that.
understand.
I'm sorry, Scale. Could you repeat what you wanted me to talk about?
Is there anything else you wanted to cover quickly?
Oh, no. I think we covered it really well.
Okay.
I think we got all the bases covered here with insurance and the legal aspect, the IT aspect, the compliance aspect. There's a million reasons to upgrade your cybersecurity, and I think everybody's giving great examples here today.
Okay, and one thing I do want to highlight that's come out in many comments here is it's not just about getting good people. It really is a team effort. So the folks on your team, attorney, technical, insurance, your internal IT, everybody has to be able to trust and work together. That is something that I've really seen in these answers here. Robert, with that, I'm going to pass it back to you for final comments.
Okay. Basically, thank you, everybody. Here's a list of ways to contact anyone, or you can go through the cyberresourcecenter.com, and there's a help desk feature there. You can just simply put in a form. It'll come to us with whatever your question, issue, or need is, and we'll route that to the most applicable person. Again, there's no cost or obligation for this. We first start, and I think dating back to somebody who maybe a lot of people on this don't know, a fellow by the name of Cy Sims, who sold a lot of clothing back in the day coming out of New York. And he was saying an informed consumer is our best customer. So you folks will be the best and get the best the more information you have, because very often in all these disciplines, we don't know enough to know who's good, who isn't, et cetera. And everybody on this conference call today, we've really aligned ourselves with, because not only are they the experts and have experience, but they're very willing. And I think they've shown that to work with people and give them information. And then if you so choose to work with them or something, great. If not, you're armed with now the information you need to make a good business decision. So that's how I would say, again, if we haven't covered questions, keep them coming in. We will respond to them. And everybody is on this, is available, and that's all their contact information for further information, or just contact us. We want to thank the Chamber for their ability to have us do this, and also do want to emphasize that any of the programs that URS is providing through the courtesy of the Chamber, as a Chamber member, you'll get a 10% discount. So wish everybody well, and give us a buzz if you need more help.
Happy holidays, everybody.
And we'll send a copy of all this to everybody. I think everybody will get a copy of this. So, you know, notes, et cetera. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.